Coming to you from an undisclosed location. We were reading Malcolm X and FBI Files. Now we're going to do a little Jung, the essential Jung. Can you read that? Can you see that? So let's get into it. And part 5, I'm going to be reading from part 5. Psychological types and self-regulating psyche. At the same time Jung was engaged in his own confrontation with the unconscious, he was also concerned with defining the difference in his approach to the problems of psychology from those adopted by Freud and Adler. How was it, he asked, that each could interpret the same material so differently? He concluded that human beings belong to different psychological types. And in 1921, his book Psychological Types was first published in Zurich. The terms extrovert and introvert were introduced by Jung and are still in current use as descriptive of personality differences. Okay, that's a little intro. Or a little heading. Introduction, Psychological Types, CW, Pars 1 to 7, or paragraphs 1 to 7. I guess that's what that means, yeah. In my practical medical work with nervous patients, I have long been struck by the fact that besides the many individual differences in human psychology, there are also typical differences. Two types especially become clear to me. I have termed them introverted and extroverted types. When we consider the course of human life, we see how the fate of one individual is determined more by the objects of his interest, and while in another it is determined more by his own inner self, by the subject. Since we all swerve rather more toward one side or the other, we naturally tend to understand everything in terms of our own type. I mention this circumstance at once in order to avoid possible misunderstandings. It will be apparent that it is one which considerably aggravates the difficulty of a general description of types. I must presume unduly upon the goodwill of the reader if I may hope to be rightly understood. It would be relatively simple if every reader knew to which category he belonged, but it is often very difficult to find out whether a person belongs to one type or the other, especially in regard to oneself. In respect of one's own personality, one's judgment is, as a rule, extraordinarily clouded. This subjective clouding of judgment is particularly common because in every pronounced type, there is a special tendency to compensate the one-sidedness of that type. A tendency which is biologically purposive, since it strives constantly to maintain the psychic equilibrium. The compensation gives rise to secondary characteristics or secondary types, which present a picture that is extremely difficult to interpret. So difficult that one is inclined to deny the existence of types altogether and to believe only in individual differences. I must emphasize this difficulty in order to justify certain peculiarities in my presentation. It must seem as if the simplest way would be to describe two concrete cases and to dissect them side by side. But everyone possesses both mechanisms, extroversion as well as introversion. And just lost my place. Hence, in order, here we go, as well as introversion, and only the relative predominance of one or the other determines the type. Hence, in order to throw the picture into the necessary relief, one would have to retouch it rather vigorously, and this would amount to a more or less pious fraud. Moreover, the psychological reactions of a human being are so complicated that my powers of description would hardly suffice. To draw an absolutely correct picture from sheer necessity, therefore, I must confine myself to a presentation of principles which I have abstracted from a wealth of facts observed in different individuals. In this, there is no question of a deductio a priori, as it might appear. It is a rather deductive presentation of empirically gained insight. He always does that. Jung does. He uses it lately. Uh, these insights will, I hope, help to clarify a dilemma which, not only in analytical psychology, but in other branches of science as well, and especially in the personal relations of human beings with one another, has led and still continues to lead to misunderstanding and discord. For they explain how the existence of two distinct types is actually a fact that has long been known, a fact that in one form or another has struck the observer of human nature or dawned upon the brooding reflection of the thinker, presenting itself as Goth's institution or intuition, for instance, as the all-embracing principle of systole or diastole, the names and concepts by which mechanisms of extroversion and introversion have been grasped are extremely varied, and each of them is adapted to the standpoint of the observer in question. But despite the diversity of the formulations and the fundamental idea common to them all constantly shines through. In one case, an outward movement of interest toward the object, and in another movement of interest away from the object to the subject and his own psychological processes. In the first case, the object turns like a magnet upon the tendencies of the subject. It determines the subject to a large extent and even alienates him from himself. His qualities may become so transformed by assimilation that the object that one might think it possessed some higher and decisive significance for him. It might almost seem as if it were an absolute determinant, a special purpose of life or fate that we should abandon, or that he should abandon himself wholly to the object. But in the second case, the subject is and remains the center of every interest. It looks, one might say, as though all the life energy were ultimately seeking the subject, and thus continually prevented the object from exercising any overpowering influence. It is as though the energy were flowing away from the object and the subject were a magnet drawing the object to itself. You all know people who want to be the center of things. And we all know people who always want to be part of a team. I'm a team person. I'm a group person. I'm a we person. Because I've never seen or heard about or read about a study humanity making any progress in the I state. It's always in the we. Everything you see, everything that's been built up, everything that you call comforts, to skyscrapers, ships, planes, technology around stoves and cooking and all was done in the we. You might say one person did work and discovered this or that, but where was that one person working? In labs. And labs were funded by or provided by or built by the we, the group. And people were usually always working together. Matter of fact, the more you study, the more you find yes, there are brilliant people, yes, there are geniuses, but there's no one genius creating a thing. It's always teams. And I'll give you an example. When I was in college in USC, the English departments were having a big war. Was William Shakespeare a lone writer, or was he part of a team? And they were combing over documents and combing over groups and combing over people that was around during Shakespeare's time and who he worked with. And it came out that yes, William Shakespeare had a group of writers that he worked with, but he was the head writer of his plays. So it kind of squashed it around that time. This was like in the 2000s, early 2000s that I remember this happening. So uh, that's why I'm a we person, a we thinker. Until next time, try to stay safe, try to stay sane.